Denis, thank you so much for doing this interview with me. First question, how you Dune?
Upon its release, Dune was crowned as one of the best movies of 2021, and was even called a masterpiece in filmmaking by others. Audience and critic scores were overwhelmingly positive, and it even did a good job at the box office, even though it was available to stream at home on HBO Max the same day it released in theaters. People were willing to sacrifice the comfort and convenience of watching it at home so that they could experience it on the big screen, which I don't really blame them. The movie has such a grand scale and scope that watching it in theaters really is the best way to experience it. And finally, after a year of praise, attention, and taking home 6 out of the 10 Oscars it was nominated for, Part 2 of Denis Villeneuve's adaptation finally gets a release date for October of 2023. So, I think it's time to take another look at Dune Part 1. Now that it's been over a year, and we've had time to stream it, buy it on Blu-ray, and really reflect on it, I think we should really take another look at the movie. Now, I should say up front that I haven't finished the first book that the movie is based on. Well, I guess technically half of the first book, because Dune is only adapting half of the story, which we'll get more into later. But I bring it up for 2 reasons. 1, to let you know that I'm not a lore expert, and 2, I'm not going to be referring to the book and pointing out everything that was changed or tweaked. Now, it's not to say that I won't be referring back to the book at all, because there are definitely things I want to mention that are changed from the book. But overall, I'm not going to docket any points or overly criticize the movie just because it deviates from the book. But I still want to at least point out some of the things that I noticed now that I'm reading the book. Some good, some bad, and just some things that are pretty interesting. But if you really want to know how different the book and movie really are, there's already videos out there like that, so go check those out if you're interested. And the last thing I'll bring up is that in this series, I try to take a more critical look at movies than I normally would. So yes, there may be things in here that you consider nitpicks, but that's kind of the point of these type of videos, and really it's all in good fun. Every movie I've talked about in this series I've really liked or even loved. I just think it's fun for me to approach these movies differently than I normally do. So yeah, I'll probably come off as an annoying nitpicking prick, but that's alright, it's part of the journey. But now with all that out of the way, I think it's time to take a look back at Dune after the hype.
I'm a big fan of Dune. Dude, Dune your mom.
Before I start really getting into the movie, I want to take a few minutes to tell you guys what I enjoyed and what it does well. What, did you think this was going to be me bitching for 10 minutes? Nah, not yet, but we'll get there. I want to give credit where it's due first. For starters, this is one gorgeous ass movie. Everything from the sets, outfits, special effects, and CGI. It all looks great. Not to mention all these beautiful ass shots. Everything feels huge and epic. The world just feels big and really has an epic scale to it all. A lot of stuff is awe-inspiring and it surprises me on how good it all looks, especially the CGI and how just real it looks on screen. Thomas Flight did a video breaking this stuff down, so if you want to know more on how they pulled this stuff off, check out his video. He touches on how important the camera position is and the lighting, and how it makes a big difference. It's all really fascinating stuff. I should also mention the music too. Hans Zimmer's score is pretty badass. It's no surprise that it won an Oscar, and the sound design itself is also great. Watching it with my headphones on, I was fully immersed and sucked in, and the sound design also won an Oscar, and again, I'm not surprised. So really, just about everything from a technical level is top notch. It looks great, it sounds great, and all around is very well made, so zero complaints from me. But let's move away from the filmmaking side and talk a little bit about the actors. This is a big cast full with a lot of talent. I don't think anyone gave a bad performance. There were a few that I wasn't that impressed with, but I'll touch more on that later. But in general, everyone was fine. Jason Momoa as Duncan and Oscar Isaac as Leto were probably my favorites, but I think most of the cast overall was good. And when the action sequences actually happened, they were pretty solid as well. I mean, really thinking about it, there's only like, 2 big action set pieces in the whole movie? And of course, the best sequence in the whole movie is when the Harkonnens launched their attack and started invading. This whole section was awesome. This part was so great that it made me want to see more, but sadly there just isn't that much action. Most of the runtime is actually spent building the world before something actually happens, which I'm a bit mixed on, but I won't get into it here. But I will say, I find the world of Dune very fascinating. It takes place, 10 or 20,000 years in the future, but yet there aren't any robots or computers. I mean, hell, they still got like scrolls and books. They mastered space travel, but they fight with these futuristic swords instead of guns and lasers. The first time I saw this stuff, it really intrigued me, which led me to watching videos explaining this stuff, and now I'm reading the book to get the answers. Because the movie doesn't touch on this stuff in particular, but it does spend a lot of time world building and explaining some other things. But it led me to looking into this stuff myself. And even though what they do explain in the movie is very interesting, I still have a few issues with it, or I guess I more so have an issue with the structure of it in the movie, and how it presents the information and how much time is dedicated to it. I'll touch more on this in a bit. But that's going to wrap up this section. It's a very well made, pretty movie with a great score, and a very fascinating world that it brings to life. And even though there are several things that it doesn't explain, I wasn't annoyed by it. I was more so fascinated with it, and it led me to look more into it, and I was pleasantly surprised by the answers. Now let's move on to my gripes with the film.
For the first time, I think I did this movie for a single audience member, which is me.
Let's pick up where we left off in the last section, about the world building and lore of Dune. So in the movie, there's quite a bit of exposition given to the viewer. As soon as the film starts, it tells you about Spice, Arrakis, the Furman, the Harkins, and really from there, for over an hour of the movie, you're just kind of learning about the world as things slowly unfold. Not a whole lot actually happens in terms of plot progression. It spends most of the time introducing important players in the story. You know, the main houses, the characters, the antagonists, the Furman, this great prophecy about the possibility of Paul being basically space Jesus. And even though most of this stuff is pretty interesting, and the world is rich with detail and it's clearly a slow building plot, I'm not gonna lie, the first time I saw it, I thought it dragged for a bit and took a while to get going. But now upon rewatching it and having a better understanding of it all, this stuff now feels even more like a drag. Really thinking about it, there's not really an inciting incident to kick the movie into gear until almost an hour and a half in. This of course is when the Harkins attack. Now it's not a bad thing to have exposition to explain things to the viewer. Hell, in sci-fi and fantasy, it's almost expected to an extent. But the issue with Dune is that there's so much of it for over an hour, and the actual story and plot unfolds very slowly, that it can feel pretty boring at times. It's a whole lot of characters walking around and just talking to each other. And it's not like you have big action sequences to break this stuff up. There's only a few in the first hour, with most of it being saved closer towards the end. And with a 2.5 hour runtime, things can feel pretty dull pretty fast, especially when the first hour or so is mostly made up of exposition about the world and characters with very little happening. And I think this might be an issue that many will face when they rewatch it, because when you first watch it and don't know anything about Dune, you kind of appreciate it walking you through the world pretty slowly. That way you don't get confused or lost. It might drag in some parts, but overall, you understand why it's being so slow. But as soon as you view it a second time, the first hour really is just a drag. But I kind of understand why they did it this way. It's to ease newcomers into everything, help them get a basic understanding of the world, and really to set up a lot of stuff that'll be important later on. Although when I compare Dune to another movie that has rich lore and a big expansive universe, Dune kind of falls short in comparison. Of course, I'm talking about Lord of the Rings. Even just looking at the Fellowship of the Ring, it too starts off with an exposition dump. But where the movies differ is that the Fellowship gets into its story a bit faster, and as you watch, you kind of learn about the world as you go without the plot having to slow down in order to teach you things. So it never really feels like a drag. Maybe you could argue that Dune is sci-fi, so the explanation is a bit more necessary. And maybe that's true. Or maybe another important factor is the main protagonist, Paul. Now I'm gonna be real with you guys. Paul is kind of boring as a character. He himself isn't that interesting. And it's really his potential powers and the prophecy around him that makes him more interesting. The only scenes where he has a bit of personality are the ones with Duncan. He isn't terribly acted or anything. He's just pretty bland and dull as hell on screen. And there aren't many moments that have him show off his personality. Now this is where I'm going to draw a comparison to the book. Paul in the book, from what I've read so far, is also not really that interesting, or at least he has a pretty bland and plain personality. Though from what I can tell in the book, that's mainly due to how he was raised. You know, he's raised to be smart, an expert in combat, and he doesn't have friends that are his own age because of fear of assassination. He is taught about politics so that he will someday be the leader of his house. And the relationship between him and his father isn't a very loving one, or at least not a very openly loving one. It's different from how it's portrayed in the movie. So what I'm saying is, he's not too far off from how he is in the book, at least from what I've read so far. Correct me if I'm wrong or if he gets better towards the end of the first book. But here's the thing, they could change him a bit more when adapting the book to the screen. They changed several things about his father and actually gave him and Paul a better father-son relationship. So it stands to reason they could tweak Paul a bit more so that he's not so dull. They did make him a bit more apprehensive about becoming the leader of his house, but that's really about it. Going back to Lord of the Rings, they really changed Aragorn's character a lot, and that was mainly to make him a more interesting character on screen and to give him a better character arc. I guess some fans probably would have been annoyed if they changed Paul more from the book than they already did, but if we get a more interesting character out of it, then I think it would have been worth it. Plus, when you're following this type of character in a 2.5 hour long movie, it makes the slow parts drag even more because you're not that invested in the main character's journey because, well, they're kind of boring. So you take a slow unfolding plot, the attention to the world building, and a boring main character, and then you got a movie that kind of feels like a drag at times, and upon rewatching it, could feel worse. And I think this is why I've seen so many people say that the movie mostly feels boring to them, which I can understand. It's really the first hour 15 that is the slowest part of the film, which is almost half of the movie. But the first hour wouldn't feel so much like a drag if we had a more interesting character to follow. Some other characters I found underwhelming were Lady Jessica and Zendaya's character. I'm willing to give Zendaya's character a pass for now, just because she's barely in the movie, even though she was all over the promotional material. But I feel the same way about Lady Jessica as I do Paul. Just boring. Like mother like son, I guess. Which again contributes to parts feeling pretty slow, because there's a portion of this movie where it's just mainly focused on Paul and Lady Jessica. Two very dull characters. Again, I want to mention that they're not bad actors at all. It just seems like the script didn't give them much to work with. They don't really have very entertaining personalities. So the acting itself is fine, just find the characters pretty dull. Okay, so between the hour 15 and hour 30 mark, something finally happens. The Harkonnens attack the Atreides, they kill the soldiers, Duncan makes his escape, Leto is captured, and Lady Jessica and Paul escape into the desert. And from this point on, things are way more interesting, because now there's an actual goal and motive we can understand. The antagonists made their move and now we see the conflict, and now our main characters are working towards a solution. emotion. In short, things are actually happening, and this section of the movie is really solid, and I find it more interesting than the first part. It just took a while to get there. Now, for as good as this section is, you still gotta deal with Paul and Lady Jessica being as bland and dry as the sand they're stepping on. But now with an actual goal and motive in place, along with some pretty good action scenes, the plot and story are actually moving along, and it makes for a more enjoyable watch. And this leads me to my final complaint, and just about everyone who's seen the movie always mentions it. It's the ending. It's pretty anticlimactic and underwhelming, really, and this is why. The movie spends a lot of time in the beginning setting up the world, and then things finally start to happen about halfway through, where we're presented with a major conflict and the characters working towards a goal. Then things build up and start happening, only for it to end prematurely, just when things are starting to get good in the last hour. It's not a bad ending, it's kind of like a cliffhanger, because there's so much that was set up here, and when things get good, it just ends. It doesn't give you that satisfying feeling. I know some people like to mention that this is not the whole story, so of course nothing's going to be resolved, which is true. But again, if you take a look at Lord of the Rings, each movie is one part to the overall story, but each movie has a conclusion and end to each of their films, and they all still feed into the overall story. Like, imagine if Fellowship ended after they fight off the lake monster and they enter the mines of Moria.
We now have but one choice. We must face the long dark of Moria.
That's almost what it feels like, just slowly setting things up and then conflict finally happens to kick the plot into gear, only for it to end prematurely. Now, I've heard the movie ends about halfway through the first book, and this is probably the best stopping place for the story. I don't know how true that is because I haven't gotten to that part of the book yet, but if you have read the book, leave a comment, let me know how true it is, and if stopping here was the best option. I don't think I have anything else to add, so let's wrap this video up.
Hey, what you reading there, champ?
Just Dune.
Just Dune? I've never heard of Just Dune. Why aren't you laughing?
So, really looking back on Dune Part 1, it's undoubtedly a very well made movie that shows us a very interesting world. But its lead characters are mostly dull, and the actual plot and story takes a while to get going, with an ending that feels a bit anticlimactic. I enjoyed it a bit more the first time I saw it, only because the slow first hour explaining everything was very intriguing, albeit a bit slow. But upon rewatches, the first hour just drags even more, which could have been helped by having a main protagonist that was more interesting. Having a more interesting or charismatic, entertaining lead can help make sure the slow parts still remain interesting because you're invested in the main protagonist. So overall, it's a fine movie, and I have a lot of respect for the filmmaking aspect of it all, and I'm genuinely fascinated by the world. It's so damn cool. I don't think it's Denis Villeneuve's best movie, but between this, Arrival, and Blade Runner 2049, the guy definitely knows how to do sci-fi, and I'm looking forward to Part 2 next year. With the world mostly set up in this movie, Part 2 should have a lot more going on in terms of the plot and characters, and hopefully I'll be finished with the book by then. But that's gonna do it for the video, guys. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, go and drop a like on it, and leave a comment, let me know, what do you think about Dune Part 1, now you had a year to sit on it and really think about it? Or if you're a fan of the book, what you think of the movie? Leave a comment, let me know. And of course, I give a nice big shout out to the channel members. You guys, you fight like demons. If you're interested in becoming a channel member, click the join button down below to check out the perks. If they interest you, consider joining, or not, it don't matter.
None of this matters.
Hello, Paul. You are currently wearing a Fremen steel suit. It collects 99% of your body's moisture, including urine and sweat. Do you understand?
Yes.
Do you have any questions? What about the poop? It does recycle the poop as well. How did you know to ask that? I took a dump in this thing the second I put it on. Laudib, the prophecy. How does he know?